Why do I love Vertigo so much? I suspect most people who watch it wonder just why it's so revered, so maybe I can help you out. This video, by the way, is going to be for people who have already seen the movie. It's an analysis with spoilers. I urge you not to deny yourself the chance to watch it for the first time and form your own opinions without any influence. You only get one chance of doing that, you know. I say this even though I wasn't actually so taken with the film the first time I watched it. I'd heard it was considered a great film, but by the time I got to the end of my first viewing, I thought, it's a good movie. I don't know if it's quite a masterpiece. Then I saw it again, and some more pieces clicked into place. Then, years later, in 2008, I spent a week watching it over and over. I took notes. I watched portions of the film over and over. I read every essay, analysis, and review I could get my hands on. I became obsessed. But why? I'd seen it a few times before, but suddenly, in February 2008, I needed Vertigo. I clung to it for dear life. I was going through some personal issues at the time. I was questioning the motives of people in my life, and I was especially questioning my own. And I connected with the way Vertigo approached these problems. All films noir, all good films noir, do that in some way or another. Nowadays, people talk about how much of a role we have in choosing what we are. Is identity something we create ourselves, or is it something foisted on us? Is it something we're born with, or is it just something we want? The devil is in the gray area between. When you can never know for sure if you are this or that, if it's something you can't help but be, or if it's a product of your own ingenuity. That's how you end up with the dichotomy of existentialism and fatalism in film noir. Vertigo addresses this problem through the dreams of loving partnerships. It's about the dangers and tragedies involved when two people try to create a dream together, or when it's imposed upon them. It's about the ambiguity in how much dreams are of our own creation and how much they're imposed by third parties, by society, by environment, by God or ghosts, or a million other things. Even after watching Vertigo obsessively for years, I can still go back to it and it feels alive. I can't find the key that explains it away, as Madeline might say. I think that's because Vertigo plugs into a fundamental mystery in human relationships that has no end. It's a black hole with no bottom. As Slavoj Zizek says in his analysis of Vertigo, it's a movie about the abyss of the depth of another person. As Gene Siskel said, it can stand for a lot of marital relationships. It's the negotiation between who someone is and who someone is perceived to be. Human beings are so complex, the human mind is so full of contradictions and meaning that inevitably one person's perception of another will be a fantasy of some kind because the truth is too complex. How can you truly know someone when people don't even know themselves? As Oscar Wilde put it, only the shallow can know themselves. Or as a character in Miller's Crossing repeatedly says, nobody knows anybody, not that well. Vertigo shows how dangerous this manner of human perception can be because loving an impression of someone is sort of like loving someone who doesn't exist. But what else can you do if you can never truly know someone? You can hope that the both of you value the same fantasy, for one thing, and the two protagonists of Vertigo do, even though they ultimately just miss each other on the journey. This is the tragedy of Vertigo. That's why Bernard Herrmann's sorrowful score is so perfect. You can hear Wagner's Tristan and Isolde in it, and the desperation of that romance, of two people who can only find romantic fulfillment together after they've been put under a spell. Isolde begins the opera as Tristan's captive, and neither has any particular interest in the other. It is only after they have both had their perceptions altered by an outside party that they are able to create a relationship. Wagner's lyrics do an admirable job of teasing out the psychological complexity of what most today would recognize as a fairly well-worn fantasy trope. Vertigo also manages to show how people are able to find connection through illusion. A dedication to fantasy is crucial to our sanity and, by extension, our survival. Director Alfred Hitchcock said he was originally drawn to the project because of the concept of a man in love with a dead woman. This is a nicely poetic expression of the fantasy because it conjures a woman who is dead and therefore not on our plane of existence, and the sadness of her being someone who was here, who has passed away, stands as a nice, tangible shorthand for the painfulness of her always being just out of reach. But what's the impossible to the hero of a fantasy? A challenge. Vertigo is about creation of fantasy and a desire to take control of reality to make those fantasies real. All four of the main characters, Scotty, Judy, Midge, and Gavin Elster, fight to take control of a dream in one way or another. They come up with impressions and they hatch schemes, they manipulate, all with the end goal of ironing the kinks out of reality and putting in a few of their own. The only one who really succeeds is Gavin Elster, because he's utterly ruthless. He doesn't have to negotiate. But even he has to be flexible, I think, which I'll get to later. We don't see him very much in the film, so we have to infer a lot. Elster's dream is to kill his wife and take all her money. So obviously her consent is not an issue, so that's one thing he doesn't have to deal with. But Elster's savvy enough to know that he has to account for human nature and desire when laying his plans. It's useful for him that the people he's manipulating believe they're doing what they're doing for their own reasons, and not his. Elster manages this by making each step on the path he lays out for Scotty properly provocative in its own right. When Scotty first meets with Elster at the shipyard, there's a small moment that very clearly demonstrates Elster's knack for this.
Scotty, do you believe that someone out of the past, someone dead, can enter and take possession of a living being?
No.
If I told you that I believe this has happened to my wife, what would you say?
Well, I'd say take her to the nearest psychiatrist, or psychologist, or neurologist, or or maybe just the plain family doctor. I'd have him check on you, too.
Then you're of no use to me. I'm sorry I wasted your time.
Scotty makes like he's about to leave, but then hesitantly turns back.
I didn't mean to be that rough.
No, it sounds idiotic, I know. And you're still the hard-headed Scot, aren't you? Always were. You think I'm making it up?
No.
This is where Elster's got his hooks into him. If Elster isn't making it up, Scotty can then only claim that Elster is either foolish or mad. What Elster did here was that he presented with conviction something he knew Scotty would find to be an utterly preposterous story, something to which Scotty could only react with loud disbelief. The idea of the dead exerting influence on the living. When Elster acts dismayed by Scotty's reaction, it naturally provokes a feeling of guilt in Scotty, which Elster is then able to massage into a vague feeling of debt, only heightened when Scotty reflexively said,
I'm supposed to be retired. I don't want to get mixed up in this darn thing.
Look.
And already you can see the ambiguity in how Scotty makes choices and in how Elster makes choices for him. Scotty says he's sorry to be so dismissive of the problem, and Elster convinces him to observe his wife without her knowledge at a restaurant. It's significant that Elster presents this as a final argument before Scotty has actually agreed to take the job. Elster says Scotty can see her at the restaurant. It sounds as though Scotty's interest in the job may depend on whether or not he finds her attractive. But it is ambiguous enough that it could also mean Scotty would be making his decision based on an assessment of her mental state derived from her observed behavior. Elster knows something else important about Scotty. Scotty's a romantic, though Elster says Scotty's still the hard-headed Scot, as though Scotty's rationality were as well established as his Scottish heritage, as though he were an old-fashioned John Knox Presbyterian. But anything attributed to Scotty's character that Elster mentions directly to Scotty should be suspect. It's useful to Elster that Scotty thinks he's rational. Madeline also calls him Scotty, despite initially saying she'd prefer to call him John. This may have been a directive from Elster to further cement this idea of hard-headed Scottishness. But of course, another thing Scotland's famous for is a belief in ghosts. James Stewart's usual down-to-earth portrayal also does not strike the viewer as a fellow who gets carried away by a fantasy, which is of course what makes the casting of Stewart so ingenious. Bernard Herrmann thought that someone like Charles Boyer would have been more appropriate for the role, but in Stewart, we can't mistake the romanticism for something the character's aware of about himself. Scotty's an idealist through and through. He sees himself as a sort of hero and sees his primary goal in life as serving justice. That's Scotty's self-image, his identity, which is thwarted by his imperfections and his nature that he never thought to account for. Now I want to talk about the second scene in the film, a long dialogue scene in which we see Midge for the first time. A very popular interpretation of Midge is that she's the normal girl that Scotty has cruelly rejected. Many casual critics talk about Midge as though she's the perfectly sensible mate that Scotty just can't see because he's all caught up in chasing a fantasy. Vertigo is certainly open to interpretation in many ways, but I'm astounded this view of Midge continues to be so popular when it's directly contradicted in the dialogue of this early scene.
Aren't you ever going to get married?
You know there's only one man in the world for me, Johnny-O.
You mean me? We were engaged once, though, weren't we?
3 whole weeks.
Yeah, good old college days. But you were the one that called off the engagement, you remember? I'm still available. Available, Ferguson.
He and Midge had been engaged in college before she called it off. She called it off. This isn't an issue of Scotty not being willing to see Midge as a romantic partner. He clearly was. She rejected him. Is she still in love with him? She says he's the only man in the world for her. The way he says he's still available makes it sound like he hasn't even been with someone else since they broke up. So why doesn't she want to marry him if she claims to be devoted to him? Because her conception of him is not as husband, but as child.
You're not lost. Mother's here.
Midge gives Scotty a furtive look when he says, with a mildly irritable dismissiveness,
Oh, now, Midge, don't be so motherly.
That's in one word the role Midge has settled into in their relationship. Mother. That's the dream she's built around her and Scotty. 2 peas in a pod, but she the wiser pea, there to guide foolish little Johnny as he innocently blunders through life. You'll notice her choice of name for Scotty is Johnny, a diminutive of John. Her tone of voice is invariably condescending. She calls him a big boy now. When Scotty the romantic says she's been wasting her time in advertising when she could be focusing on painting fine art, she remonstrates that her advertising job is a living. Midge assumes her pragmatism makes her more of an adult than Scotty. Yet she's jealous when Scotty shows interest in another woman. Remind you of any other mother figures in Hitchcock movies? I would argue that the coexistence in Midge of a mother identity and a repressed lover identity makes her a prototype for Norman Bates. There's a bit of madness in her because the dream Midge wants to impose is inadequate to satisfy her own sexual needs. Her ego would cast her as Scotty's mother figure, but her libido has other ideas. This is how we end up with that fascinating, bizarre scene where she makes a parody of Carlotta's portrait, putting her face in place of Carlotta's. The scene is so striking and so strange, it astounds me it's so rarely discussed. I suspect it's because Midge has so many stans who are inclined to overlook the possibility that she might be as twisted as anyone else in the film. Well, to be fair, she's no murderer. But do you know how much time and effort goes into a painting like that? Paintings like these are usually pretty rough when you see them in movies, sometimes noticeably, because before the advent of AI artists, art like that was just not something you could knock off while also meeting the other demands of film production. Midge put time and effort into the painting, and Hitchcock made sure time and effort was put into the painting. She intends it as a joke, but of course Scotty doesn't find it very funny. Of course. Let's take sex out of it for a moment, if we can. Just imagine a cop who's following a woman who may be suicidal. Would he laugh about an elaborate joke like this? Probably not. Why would Midge think it's a good idea? For one, she's jealous, but she also doesn't want to confront the motive behind her jealousy, so she prevents herself from thinking clearly about this. Johnny is her kid. They have laughs together. You know how it is with your close family members. She tries to take it to the private joke space. Part of her brain has blundered on through the woods, willfully ignoring what another part of her brain is telling her. So Midge's castle in the clouds collapses around her, and we get this moment that spells it out. She's lost some marbles. She's forced to take a horrifying peek at reality, starkly contrary to her dream. If I were to speculate further about Midge's mind and her past, I would guess that in her college relationship with Scotty, she became frightened of consummating a sexual relationship with him. So she created the mother identity as a safe haven that has become increasingly constrictive as she's grown. But back to Scotty. When he says, "I'm still available Ferguson," there's a barely suppressed bitter edge to Scotty's voice, leading one to believe that he may indeed have been single ever since college. And labeling himself available Ferguson in itself suggests that he's been alone for so long that being single is something he believes is associated with him by his acquaintances. But how could he date if he's hanging out at Midge's apartment all the time talking about women's underwear? The discussion of their respective love lives follows a brief, candid discussion about women's undergarments, with a strange, lacy pink bra as a prop. To an audience in 1958, this would have seemed quite racy, and it would have been clear that Midge and Scotty are unusually comfortable discussing sexuality for a man and woman who aren't a couple. But Scotty might also be too busy with his work to look for another woman. Midge mentions that Scotty had been a lawyer who switched to working as a policeman because he had decided that he was going to be chief of police one day. Scotty is not someone to be bound by a career path, and indeed believes he lives in complete freedom. He says he's retiring and feels he can because he is a man of independent means, which means he has enough money that he's not only able to abruptly alter his career path at whim, but he's able to retire at whim too. Work has never been about survival for Scotty. It's never been a living. It's been about pursuing his dreams. He has something of the power and freedom Elster wants. So I wonder if envy was part of the reason Elster chose Scotty for his victim. Is Scotty a good detective? Was he a good lawyer? It's an interesting question because it leads us to consider how much he might deserve Midge's condescension. If Scotty really doesn't measure up to the heroic roles he tries to put himself in, it would go to explain his persistent need for validation. Validation is part of what seems to draw him to Madeline. She seems to need him. She validates that hero identity. She willingly participates in what is potentially just a fantasy of Scotty being a capable man, a lawyer or a policeman or a hero. Until recently, he certainly didn't see himself as someone who freezes up and lets someone fall to their death. Scotty's debilitating acrophobia perfectly and succinctly represents what the movie's about. The existential horror of finding oneself behaving in a way contrary to one's perceived or preferred identity, and to disastrous consequences. In the context of the movie, the sensation of vertigo provides a neat shorthand for Scotty's despair at causing, because of his inadequacy, a fellow police officer to die. This is not how a hero's supposed to act, so what is he now? He can try to forget or rationalize what happened, but any visible, significant distance of empty space below him will instantly remind him that he's not what he thinks he is. Heights aren't merely an alarming mortal peril. They are his nemesis, a crooked and alien version of his self-image made real. After seeing Madeline die, Scotty has a terrible dream in which it appears that he has become Madeline. He sees himself standing over Carlotta's open grave, as Madeline did. He sees himself falling towards the red-tiled roof of San Juan Bautista, as Madeline fell to her death. And this makes sense, because Madeline never existed except as a mutual fantasy shared between himself, Judy, and Elster. Scotty's almost as much Madeline as Judy was. I'm reminded of when director Joseph von Sternberg was quoted as saying, "I am Marlene Dietrich." Dietrich, the star of his early best films, heard the quote and agreed. The Marlene Dietrich that exists up on screen is something she and Sternberg created together, and he has as much right to it as she. So Madeline is as much Scotty's as Judy's because her performance was shaped by his responses and needs. His responses and needs partially dictated her behavior. Madeline is the dream they created together. Of course, Scotty doesn't know yet that Madeline was merely a role Judy was playing. Even when Judy decided to try to prevent Elster from murdering his wife, she didn't tell Scotty the truth. Why not? Because she's participating in the fantasy too. She finds it fulfilling, as Scotty does, and she's instinctively hesitant to break the spell. From here, you can see why their relationship doesn't work when he meets her again as Judy. Is forcing her to dress a certain way any different than her relationship with Gavin, where she obviously tolerated it? It's very different for Judy, who seems tortured by the experience. As Hitchcock put it,
was when she came back
C'est que lorsqu'elle est
from
revenue,
having her hair made blonde,
après s'être fait teindre les cheveux
and it
blancs,
wasn't up.
et ce n'était pas relevé en chignon.
Ah oui, oui, oui.
This means
Ceci voulait dire
she has stripped, but won't take her knickers off.
Judy doesn't want to change back into Madeline, but she also doesn't leave Scotty. She is a willing participant in this, however reluctantly. Although neither of them exactly understand the nature of the fantasy and why they need it, they're both instinctively trying to recreate it. Judy's reluctance is due entirely to her connection to a crime, something Scotty doesn't yet know about. Otherwise, she probably would be perfectly content to dress up for Scotty, as she evidently was for Elster. The reason the stripping metaphor works is because nudity is associated with shame, with the discovery of one's sins. In Hitchcock movies, a woman trying to hide a crime, like Janet Leigh in Psycho, is like a woman trying to cover herself. And in To Catch a Thief, when Grace Kelly tries to get Cary Grant to cop to his secret identity as a thief, it's her wanting to see him naked. Elster tells Scotty how he longs for the power and freedom enjoyed by wealthy men in old San Francisco. Through his actions in the film, it's revealed that Gavin prefers total dominance in his relationships with women and very little intimacy. He cares so little about his wife that he wants to kill her. He's having an affair with Judy, whom he uses to pose as his wife and misleads Scotty, and then abandons her when he no longer has any use for her. The ghost he decides to tell Scotty has possessed his wife may or may not actually be an ancestor of the real Mrs. Elster. I'm inclined to believe she is because I like to believe her ghost is real, that through Scotty's dreams she has tipped him off about the necklace. The ghost is Carlotta Valdez, a young woman who went mad when her wealthy lover abandoned her and took her child. She became, as the bookstore owner tells Scotty, the Mad Carlotta. There's another broken dream, Carlotta's dream of love and a family. Elster tells Scotty he's worried Madeline has inherited this madness, but I think the movie clearly shows this particular madness is an infectious disease rather than an inherited one. Perhaps because Elster doesn't understand the nature of truly loving human relationships, he doesn't anticipate Scotty and Judy falling in love. He assumes his money is power. He fails to anticipate that Scotty's earnest desire to protect Madeline and help her would be more attractive to Judy. Like Midge, Elster errs because of his faith in pragmatism, but unlike Midge, Elster's agenda is not foiled by this unforeseen circumstance. After Madeline's death, when Scotty stumbles on Judy in her normal attire, we find Judy's style is quite different. Francois Truffaut observed during his interview with Hitchcock that there's an animal quality to Judy. He pointed out that she doesn't wear a bra, which Hitchcock confirmed. Her form-fitting green sweater is revealing, but bears a distracting polka dot trim. Her hair and makeup are bold contrasts, but very strange. Her forehead framed by obviously artificially arranged flattened ringlets. From her appearance, one might deduce that Judy has passion, but lacks the sophistication required to craft a look that makes her as carnally attractive as she wants to be. We could say that Gavin's plot helped her manifest her desired identity as a beautiful seductress better than she'd ever managed to do on her own. This lack of sophistication also prevents her from hatching a scheme like Elster's. When she met him, I suspect she was a low-level criminal of some kind. Maybe Elster caught her trying to pick his pocket. She obviously didn't mind getting involved with a man for money, and she obviously didn't mind accepting the role of Mrs. Elster's imposter. The means and objectives of Gavin's scheme seemed reasonable to her. Gavin's not likely to have gone ahead with any collaborator whose predilections he had any reason to doubt. The makeover Gavin gives to the faux Mrs. Elster not only makes her resemble the real Mrs. Elster more and seem more credible as a wealthy woman, it also provides a vehicle for Judy's passion and fulfills her desire to be attractive. The gray with blonde combination is bizarre and striking, like Judy's own style, but much more effective. These are bold color choices, but deployed with a more delicate sensibility, effectively creating excitement mixed with pleasure. Hitchcock's keen blocking contributed to this effect as well, as in the very first shot of Judy as Madeline, where her bare back, contrasted with an elegantly draped green dress, immediately captures the viewer's eye amidst the clutter of the rest of the restaurant's patrons. But Judy's an independently thinking and feeling being, and whatever Gavin might think, or whatever she might think, she can't be merely his pawn, especially not when the situation suits her more deep-seated personal motives. She's too human, too complicated for an identity created by her or imposed on her, or a hybrid of the two. First-time viewers often find it a little jarring that Scotty, after rescuing Madeline from the bay, takes the apparently unconscious woman to his home, strips her naked, and puts her in his bed. This is one of the reasons it's a good idea to watch the movie at least once before you've been exposed to any significant spoilers. This idea of people having to get naked after getting unexpectedly soaked is something that appears in movies again and again. It's useful to observe yourself on your first viewing. Think back and ask yourself if you just accepted it as a normal part of the movie fantasy, or if you immediately realized Scotty had done something very strange. Be honest. Why didn't he take her to a hospital? Perhaps he wanted to leave the decision up to her or Elster. Elster did say he didn't want doctors involved yet, but Madeline jumping into the bay and losing consciousness seems more than enough cause to seek medical attention. Taking Madeline to a doctor seemed the first reasonable course of action to Scotty when Elster just told him she was experiencing lapses in memory. So what's changed? Even if he didn't want to take her to the hospital after she jumped into the bay, he might have taken her to Midge. Perhaps Midge wasn't available at the time, but it seems more likely that Scotty simply wanted her to himself. In any case, if he had been thinking clearly, he'd have realized that few situations could have been worse from the woman's perspective than waking up to find herself naked in the bed of a strange man. But Scotty was not thinking clearly. His attempt at a reassuring smile when she wakes up and sees him looks almost like a 16-year-old boy at a peep show. Scotty's sexual repression is getting mixed up in his self-image as a hero. This is the kind of thing that postmodernist texts tend to deconstruct ham-fistedly. An image comes to my mind from Guy Madden's Dracula, Pages from a Virgin's Diary, of the group of assembled male heroes huddled over the suffering form of Lucy, all with ridiculous, undisguised expressions of lust on their faces. There seems to be this belief in gender analyses that the traditional male hero is a liar, that the do-gooder is just a mask worn by an opportunistic rapist. The truth isn't nearly so simple. Scotty really believes he's an agent of good. But like Midge, who can't account for her sexual urges invading her conception of herself as mother, Scotty can't account for his sexual urges invading his conception of himself as hero. They're two things that feel good to him, and he doesn't always consciously know when they're in conflict. Scotty tells Madeline later,
I'm responsible for you now. You know, the Chinese say that once you've saved a person's life, you're responsible for it forever, so I'm committed.
Scotty feels it's a point of honor to take care of her, and he feels it's his role to explain things to her and sort things out for her. It's his role to know more than she, even when he actually doesn't. That's why the explanations he conjures of her visions become increasingly strained, to the point where he gestures at a small plastic horse triumphantly, as though it explains Madeline's visions of several distinctly different live horses. Scotty's not yet aware that the roles he's chosen for himself as hero and protector are not enough to define his whole personality. So he's more confident in himself than he otherwise would be, and assumes all of his actions and impulses are the actions and impulses of a hero and protector. After his experiences with Midge, Scotty's thrilled to be in a relationship where he is the dominant partner. Or so it seems to him. In fact, Judy's in as much control of him as he is of her, maybe more so. Gavin probably didn't anticipate that Scotty would take the unconscious Madeline home with him and undress her. Judy could have chosen to wake up at any time, but instead, she decides to observe Scotty carrying her and undressing her completely. Why? Perhaps she feels this will tighten her psychological grip on him, though it's hard to imagine Scotty not trying to help her just because he hadn't seen her naked. The more likely explanation is that Judy does it because she enjoys it. It flatters her as someone who wants to be seductive, but she's also a kind of voyeur here, as she observes his naively perverse actions without his knowledge, making her more privy to his weakness than he is. It must be exciting also from her perspective as a criminal. Scotty's a cop, yet he's clearly at least as weak as she is. In being privy to Scotty's secret perversity, according to the normal logic of Hitchcock's films, she sees him more naked than he sees her. She continues in this vantage point as she watches him struggle to solve a riddle she knows has no answer. So Judy is on board for sharing this dream with Scotty. The only problem is that after the real Madeline is dead, Judy doesn't want to be exposed as Gavin's accomplice, but finally she relents and gives Scotty what he wants. Arguably, this makes Judy the bravest person in the film. In one of the movie's most famous scenes, when Judy's reverse striptease is complete and she stands nakedly Madeline before him, there is a powerful moment that seems impossibly to recapture what they had before by some fey power as they're bathed in an unnatural green light. The world seems to Scotty to dissolve into the San Juan Bautista stables as Bernard Herrmann's score becomes frantic before it crescendos with the pair's passionate kiss. It seems for a moment that they've actually resurrected the dream that initially brought them together, and perhaps Scotty's reclaimed his own identity. Or is his identity stuck at San Juan Bautista, the last place he saw Madeline alive? I love the troubled look on Scotty's face in between his passionate kisses with Madeline. Even now, he senses something isn't quite right. But it's also a lovely moment. The hint of trepidation earns the sorrow expressed in Bernard Herrmann's score. That's the Tristan and Isolde at work. In the very next scene, Scotty's sitting comfortably and watching Judy put on some jewelry, preparing to go out to eat with him. Could it be they're about to embark on a healthy, fulfilling relationship? One can only guess, because it is here that Scotty sees Judy wearing Carlotta's necklace and realizes that Judy doesn't just look like Madeline, she's in fact the same woman. Realizing he's been had, and so thoroughly, seems to enrage Scotty. Now he knows how naked he's been the whole time. Now he knows that when he thought he was the master of this romantic voyage, he was only a puppet on the strings of Elster and Judy. Indeed, his rage and humiliation must have been profound. But there's more to it than that. The cop identity, the hero identity, isn't entirely for the purpose of keeping Scotty's sanity together. Or rather, it would be useless for the purpose of keeping him sane if that were its only function. Scotty is truly repulsed by the idea that he was party to such a heinous crime. The final scene is nightmarish as Scotty takes her up to San Juan Bautista. At the mission, Scotty drags Judy through the route of that fateful day.
I don't want to go. I'd rather wait here.
Oh, I need you.
Why?
I need you to be Madeline for a while.
Actually, what he needs now is for her to be Judy for the first time. Before, his conception of himself as a hero was based on identifying her as Madeline. Now, when he realizes the machinations of Gavin and Judy are truly to blame, his desired identity is dependent on recognizing her as Judy. If Madeline died because he couldn't get up the stairs, then he's a failure. If the true Madeline was already dead, Gavin had broken her neck, then Scotty's a victim of evildoers. Of course, his vertigo disappears because now the world makes sense again. He is a good man because Gavin is a bad man. But where does that leave Judy? She's in a gray area. She says she tried to stop Gavin, and we can see part of Scotty's starting to believe her.
But it was you that screamed. Why did you scream?
I wanted to stop it, Scotty. I ran up to stop it.
You wanted to stop it. Why did you scream? Since you tricked me so well up to then, you played the wife very well.
She tries to make him understand how brave she had been, how she had willingly compromised her safety by dressing as Madeline for him, rendering her guilt naked, not just for him, but for anyone who might recognize her. But he's still a cop, and she willingly broke the law, and maybe what's worse, from the standpoint of his ego, she still manipulated him. It's too complicated. So suddenly, a nun walks in from the shadows, frightens Judy, and she dies for real. That's arguably the role for religion, to iron out life's ambiguities. And considering how torturous those ambiguities can be, you should really hesitate before you say the church performs no useful function. But you could also argue that, like King Kong before her, Judy, at the end of Vertigo, dies for our sins. Like King Kong, who was really an honest animal, lost in the artificial construction of the human city necessary for our survival, Judy is the sexually animalistic figure lost in the artificial constructions of the human mind necessary for our survival. In the end, she just didn't fit into the blueprint. The calculations she represented were too complicated for Scotty to work out in that moment. So this intricate story comes to a simple end, simply beautiful, because it is an undeniable tragedy.